All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May webinar of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council, where we spotlight New York State and cannabis in New York. I'm Jennifer Cabrera, and I will be the moderator for this excellent program. And today I'm joined by three excellent guests, including my colleague from Vicente Cedarburg, Michelle Bodian, Adriana Kurtzer of Plant Medicine Law Group, and a very special guest, Vladimir Bautista of the Happy Monkey, New York's most esteemed smoking lounge. So thank you for coming out today. Well, coming to your computer and watching us. So I am on the board of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council, and I'm sure maybe not all of you are familiar with this organization as it's quite new. The purpose of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council is really to lend a voice to Hispanics and anyone of Latin American origin in the cannabis industry. And this is not just folks who are looking to enter into the industry, but also anyone who, this is also for education, increasing education among the Hispanic and Latinx populations in the United States. I am a first generation Cuban American. I grew up in Newark, and I can tell you that the stigma of cannabis was very real, especially with my grandparents' generation, not so much with my dad, who's a big fan and remains one. But for many in the Hispanic community, this is something that is off limits. And so the National Hispanic Cannabis Council aims to address that. So the immediate purpose, though, of today's webinar is a spotlight. This is from our legal committee, and we are looking at the laws on cannabis in New York State. As you probably might know, New York legalized cannabis last year, and there's been a lot happening. So let's dive in and start with an introduction of our esteemed panelists. So I'll start with you, Mr. Bautista. Please introduce yourself.
How's it going, everyone? Honor and a pleasure to be here. My name is Vladimir Bautista. I'm co-founder and CEO of Happy Monkey, born and raised in New York City, Harlem, Hamilton Heights, first generation Dominican. And Happy Monkey started, as you said, as a lounge, but we have a wow. We don't do that anymore. It has morphed more into a movement now. We do everything from advocacy, events, merchandise, apparel, and hopefully now we'll be entering the plant touching phase. Then just happy to be here, and what an amazing time to be a New Yorker and a Latino.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's great to have you here. Next, my colleague at Vicente Cedarburg, Michelle Bodian, who is, in my opinion, the subject matter expert on New York cannabis. Please.
Oh God, now I can't bungle any answers. Thanks for that, TF, Jen. Appreciate that. So as Jen said, work together at Vicente Cedarburg, so not as exciting as everything Vladimir has going on, boring attorney over here, but certainly a necessary part, standing up any new market. So my quick background in 2 seconds, actually got started in the agricultural industry and then transitioned over to cannabis. As it's a plant, you got to grow it first and foremost. And heading up, along with Jen and some other colleagues, our efforts in the tri-state, particularly focused on New York. So excited to be here and talk about everything that's to come, because there's so much to do in New York.
Thank you, Michelle. And last, the star of the show, as always, Adriana Kurtzer.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adriana Kurtzer. I am one of the 2 founding partners of Plant Medicine Law Group, a woman-owned psychedelics and cannabis law firm that operates in New York, California, and Oregon. And I was born and raised in São Paulo, and then left when I was 17 and came to the United States for university and have not left. So technically I am a half Texan, half Brazilian New Yorker now who has been holding her breath since 2015, waiting for New York to get its act together. And so now very, very, very excited to be able to aid the community that I've been so excited to be a part of as a lawyer as it all comes online.
Thank you so much, Adriana. And of course, I am Jennifer Cabrera, and Michelle and I are with the law firm of Vicente Cedarberg, which is, I think, probably the only national law firm that focuses exclusively on the cannabis and hemp industries. We're founded in Denver in 2010, and we launched our New York office in 2019, which is when I joined. So very excited to see progress in our city. So again, this presentation, this live session is presented by the legal committee of the National Hispanic Cannabis Council. Vicente Cedarberg is one of the founding members of the NHCC, and our mission is to educate the U.S. Hispanic community on health, wellness, and economic aspects of the cannabis industry, and then to encourage their participation. So turning it over to the actual substantive topics today, I'd like, Adriana, could you give us an overview of the current state of cannabis in New York?
Sure. And what I want to do is I'm going to give an overview and then toss it right after I speak to Vlad. And what I also want to do in my part is make this webinar a little different from the other kind of lawyer-run webinars that talk only about the law. I really want to draw a bridge in this conversation about what is happening on the legal front, but then also very much what's happening on the ground. So I'll give a little bit of that perspective in my recap, and then we'll toss it over to Vlad. So big picture, MRTA was signed into law in March 31st, 2021. And that is really the law that outlines the way cannabis is, the way the new cannabis industry is going to shake out in New York. So since that was passed in 2021, we've had the Cannabis Control Board and the Office of Cannabis Management be formed, start holding meetings, start drafting regulations, start sharing regulations, and start receiving comments on them. First thing that we saw was conditional cultivation licenses. Those have already been opened up for application, and some of those licenses have already been given out. And those target really hemp growers that are converting and transitioning into cannabis. The next set of licenses that you have probably heard of coming down the pipeline is conditional adult use retail dispensary licenses. Let's just call them CARD for short. And where we are on that is they have proposed regulations have been issued to the public to comment on. So you can read them. You can send in your comments by May 31st, so the end of this month. But those licenses have not yet been opened for the submission of applications. They're just kind of out there for you to read them and share your thoughts with the OCM. Other licenses will become available in 2023, and there's a lot of speculation about timing of when they're going to drop. I'm going to kind of avoid that, in this chat. So kind of talking a little bit more about what's been happening on the ground. Cease and desist letters have been sent by the OCM to operators of illegal storefronts. So we've seen some already kind of movement on the kind of enforcement front. But you're also seeing cannabis teams or entities that are planning to apply for licenses, building teams and chasing after financial commitments with the appropriate language that things are contingent on the receipt of a license. So you're kind of seeing, regulations taking shape. You're also seeing certain forms of enforcement, and you're also seeing preparation on the entrepreneurial level now and not waiting until the regulations drop. Vlad, on to you.
Yeah, I think that right now where we are is like where there, as you said, 2021 things got passed. I don't know if people knew there was a CRTA and then there was the MRTA, and thank God we got the MRTA because the CRTA was horrible. It just to help people understand how monumental and historical this bill was. The CRTA had no home grow, no consumption lounge, barely any social equity, had a component where they were trying to like auction off or do some kind of system of licensing. So that's why part of our advocacy effort was that we created a petition in 2021 where we got thousands of people to sign a petition for the MRTA. We got thousands of people from around the country to repost on social media. And hopefully that helped nudge what we have now, which is the MRTA, which is not perfect, but better than I think than most of what we've seen in the country. Because just the mere fact that you can smoke anywhere, you can smoke tobacco, that is monumental. I don't think that's happened anywhere in the country. Home grow, consumption lounges, and for the state to try and make the first 100 licenses to people that were sort of quasi legacy or impacted by the war on drugs just shows that their heart's in the right place and they have good intentions, because I don't think that any program in the country has started in this manner. Is it perfect? No, but we can't let perfect get in the way of good. And I think that the pros outweigh the cons. There's some things that I don't like in the first round right now, one requirement is that you have a conviction. The other one is that you own more than 10% of a profitable business for 2 years. I think that's a little tricky because, most people that were in the legacy market probably won't have that requirement. So I think that one is a little bit tough right there to really give it to the people that they thought would benefit off of it. But for the most part, I'm really optimistic, and I'm really proud of New York of really trying to, take a different approach than many other states have taken, like California, where they tried to ostracize and eliminate the legacy market and put high barriers of entry for them not to enter. And in return, they ended up with a legacy market that's like 7 to 10 times bigger than the legal market. And through that process, consumers lose because they get less tested cannabis. The state lose, they make less money. And these people that have been battling the war on drugs for 80 years do not get to become upstanding citizens and become taxpayers and create generational wealth. So ultimately, everybody loses, and big corporate cannabis loses too because the market cap is lower. So I think this approach is more comprehensive and much more sustainable.
It's true. And it's also amazing how much of this is just pure luck that Governor Cuomo left when he did under the circumstances he did. We would not have the MRTA, and we would not have the CCB and OTM that we have now otherwise. Well, moving on then, thank you for that. Michelle, there are some licenses available in New York, right? The cultivation licenses. Can you tell us a bit about those and who they're available to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, speaking of things that we didn't know were going to exist, so there was a law that was passed, I won't say out of nowhere, because certainly, people had been working on these behind the scenes, the farmer lobby, the hemp farmers, all of that. But, we thought we were set with the MRTA, and then wait a second, new law passes, new license type. So in February, so only a few months ago, New York legislature passed, governor signed a new initiative to put, as the governor's office says, farmers first. So this is to allow hemp farmers to grow adult use cannabis. So of course, there's certain qualifications that you need to meet, but notably about these licenses, and I'll quickly touch on those qualifications, but this is a live application. If you meet these standards, you can be applying. 90 of these licenses have been issued, so 90 farmers are starting to grow THC in New York, which is huge. I'm going to say that again. People are growing THC cannabis in New York State for the first time under a state regulated program. Yeah, it's only certain people, and you had to have grown hemp and all these other requirements, but this is monumental for the state of New York. This is what's so much more to come, standing up this industry in this state. So, in order to qualify, you have to have been licensed by New York Department of Ag and Markets to grow hemp prior to December 31st, 2021. They didn't want a mad dash. Everyone saying, I can grow hemp. Let me fill out a quick application. So there was bright line cutoff. You had to have been licensed. Not only had to have been licensed, it had to be for growing CBD, that specific cannabinoid hemp, rather than for fiber or grain. So it has to be for CBD. And not only did you have to have grown for CBD prior to December 31st, but you actually have to harvest it, meaning you had to have been successful. So it really couldn't have been kind of a research, let me dabble, let me try it, let me throw in the towel. I don't feel like actually pulling this plant out of the ground. You actually have to have harvested for 2 out of the past 4 years. So pretty narrow subset of who's qualified and who's able to get this license. But again, 90 have already been issued, plenty more pending. We'll keep seeing OCM and CCB issue these. And then we will see, more and more of these coming online. That application window opened up March 15th and it will close June 30th, 2022. So moment in time, and this will be a conditional cultivation license. So it's good for 2 years. You can do some light processing under that, meaning pre-rolls. And then after that time, you can apply for a full-scale cultivation license.
Oh, thanks for that, Michelle. How about the conditional processor licenses? There's a lot of talk about the hemp processors being able to get in on this, and because the conditional cultivator licenses don't allow for extraction, right? So the New York's legal market is not going to include any of these products. Yeah. What is the timeline for conditional processing?
So we know, again, same law that passed conditional cultivation, there will be conditional processor licenses. So of the minimal world who was eligible for conditional cultivation, it's even a smaller window for conditional processors, but we don't have any visibility into that license when it's going to come online. Everything coming out of the state is just saying it'll be available soon, but their soon is not my soon. My soon would be tomorrow. Their soon's probably like 6 months. I would imagine some of the thought process is they just approved these licenses. It's going to take a while to get the genetics. New York's going the Immaculate Conception route. So however the genetics get into the state, gets planted, then they have to harvest. Then maybe they'll start issuing some of these for some of these licenses for application. But, I imagine they're thinking this isn't a priority, and we'll touch on the conditional retail ones, maybe more of the focus right now, because there's nothing to process even if this license was issued. And it's only about a dozen, 18 people businesses that are going to qualify for this anyway. So not a huge rush there. And soon, we'll see it soon, Jen, to answer your question.
Sounds good. Thank you. So just to recap, to break it down for me, is we have the only legal growers in New York are these conditional cultivators. They are the source for all products that will be sold at retailers until the state opens up who can be a cultivator. Is that right?
Yep,
I don't think that's right, Jen, because I believe that like 3 of the MSOs are also growing.
That's true, but none of them are growing for the adult use market right now. They can only grow for medical. Isn't that right?
But before now, I think medical never had THC flower. That's
true. They did open up for flower. Any idea on the timing for when the registered organizations can start selling to adult use? Do we have any clues there?
So in order to do it, they need to pay the fee to convert. And the state hasn't said what that conversion fee is going to be, and it's going to fund the social equity program. So right now, chicken and an egg until they name the number. I mean, I think we're all assuming everyone's just going to pay it, but the state hasn't come out yet with what that number is going to look like, which would only be my backing into timeline. So I'm going to give a non-answer and say we don't know yet, but everyone's obviously waiting because they would be able to then start providing product in addition to these conditional hemp farmers to the adult market.
So thank you. So the conditional cultivators only making flower and pre-roll that's being grown outdoors and in greenhouses. They need markets. They need stores to sell it in. Right now, there are no stores. Adriana, how do stores get licensed to sell this?
Right. So the first set of stores that will come online are related to what Vlad alluded to earlier. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about what the conditional adult use retail dispensary licenses, CARD, entail. So big picture first. There will be a limited number of licenses, between 100 and 200 licenses given out under CARD. Draft regulation is out for comment right now. And so what I'm going to talk about, in this segment is all based on that draft regulation. So It might change. It probably will change in certain respects. And I'm only going to give the very big kind of overview. So if you are listening to this right now, take in what I'm saying, but then really do the boring work of cracking open the proposed regulation and seeing all of the minutia and all of the details. So with all of those disclaimers, you will be sending in a $2,000 application fee together with a pretty meaty disclosure package that's going to ask for information on you, anyone involved in the businesses, and spouses. So when I say significant disclosure package, this is going to be one of those mega multi-day pulling paper projects in anybody's life, plus a business plan and other requirements. So prepare yourself for a pretty big project just for the application. Now, who is eligible? So let's start with the number one big requirement, and let's call it New York Nexus. So a connection to New York. So you are an individual with certain ties to New York, or the majority owner of a corporation with significant ties to New York, or a nonprofit that has significant ties to New York. So that's the first thing. So why is that? Because we want New Yorkers first for anything that's going to come down the pipeline. Again, look at the minutia of the language to understand exactly what the definition of New York connection is. All right. Then the next requirement, and let's separate this second requirement into two parts. First are the nonprofits that qualify, and second are certain types of individuals. So for the nonprofits that qualify, you're going to have to be a 501c3 that serves justice-involved individuals. Let's put a pin on that because Michelle is going to get back after I speak and go into what that whole world of justice-involved individuals means and requires. So again, a 501c3 serving justice-involved individuals in communities with high rates of cannabis-related arrests and issues and all that stuff. This 501c3 has to have at least 2 years of positive net assets or profits and a history of creating vocational opportunities for justice-involved individuals. And last requirement, has justice-involved individuals on its board or as officers. So we're kind of describing a unicorn of a nonprofit out there. So if you are not a nonprofit and you are an individual, you are a justice-involved individual and then your residence at the time of the arrest, you have to disclose, and there are different parts of the residence requirement that will be given different weight. So open the regs and see exactly what that means. That means communities that have been disproportionately affected by cannabis-related arrests, certain median income, and other requirements. The next thing is that you as a justice-involved individual are involved in a qualified business. Now wait for this. So qualified business that has had net profits for at least 2 years. And now this is what Vlad was talking about earlier. This individual must have at least 10% ownership of this company and exercise control. Now, what's weird about that is rarely does a person who owns 10% of something control it. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I hope people will comment on in the regs. Control, the term control is not defined in the proposed regulations. And it's also not clear if that control has to overlap with the years that something, that the business was profitable. So that those are the requirements just in brief, broad strokes. Now, there are a couple of things to consider as, special considerations. So the first goes to the issue of locations. So the locations for these card licenses will be overseen by the Dormitory Authority of New York. They will be assigned to licensees. That means you don't really get to choose the exact location of your retail spot. You're going to rank your preferences, but you might be assigned something outside of your immediate, let's say, living or, existential geographic range. One of the advantages, though, is that the dormitory authority will issue spaces that are either renovated or renovation ready. And through many mechanisms, individuals that receive these licenses and receive these spaces will have support with leasing. Details kind of TBD. And there will be loan funds available to the card licensees, and they will receive support with construction services. So I'm being very vague. We can go into more detail, but the general idea is that the state is acting in relation to this first crop of licenses in a manner that shows that it will be incredibly invested in the success of these businesses. So there will be operational support, there will be financial support, there will be actual, let's call it physical renovation, space delivery support. But there are some quirks, I think, to this, to the license requirements that I look forward to hearing everybody's perspectives on the panel. So Vlad, I'm very curious to start off by hearing your take on kind of all of those specifics.
Well, like I said earlier, I think that, their intentions in the right place. They're looking at things from the right lens, from what Michelle was talking about earlier, starting with the hemp farmers. I think that was a major step in the right direction, because I think that something that a lot of people don't know, but I know because, I was in the legacy market for 20 years, that New York City is the biggest legacy market in the world, consumes like 900, they estimate like 900,000 pounds a year or something like that. So for you to ramp up to that level of product and cultivation, it's going to take quite a while. So I think it was a good effort in that direction to give those 90s hemp farmers that opportunity, and also these people that suffered so much loss in the hemp industry, where it went from like 200-300 a pound to like 20-30 cents a pound. It's kind of like repairing the harm in that sense, also giving small business an opportunity, the first crack, which we all know first mover advantage is very important in markets like this, to try to be a real piece and be able to scale up in the future, as she said, if things go well. And then as far as everything else, like I said, I really like that New York is really committed financially to not only getting people giving people the funding for the build up, but I believe also they are going to grant a separate loan that's going to give them operational costs, to give them some type of runway till they get profitable. So in that perspective, I think it's really good. And I think the barrier of entry is very low cost. I think if you qualify, it's like $2,000 or something like that. I think that's very fair. The only part that I have, my only gripe is what you said, Adriana, where the whole owning 10% majority control of a company, that's like kind of like a form of redlining to a lot of people that, in other words, would be able to benefit off of this, that really deserve it. So that's my only gripe. But like I said, we can't let perfect get in the way of good. Ultimately, I think, it's heading in the right direction. There's still a lot of tweaks and a lot of fixing to be done, but I just think that it's putting the focus on, instead of like on the billions and the trillions that are going to come on small business, people that were harmed by the war on drugs, farmers that were harmed by the oversaturation of hemp and big corporate cannabis. So I think ultimately New York has its heart in the right place. Of course, this is not an easy, it's a big mountain to climb, but I think they are starting off on the right foot.
I have a question really for everyone, but especially Bud, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. New York has, I know we're about to get into justice involved individuals, but it's so limited who actually qualifies here. Well, you know what? Let me put a pin in that until we get to Michelle talking about it. Sorry.
No,
Anything else on this topic, or shall we move on?
It's a relevant preview of like who can
Go
qualify.
on.
Yeah.
So who does qualify here, Michelle? I feel like it's not many people.
I mean, we have to remember it's a big state and we're not talking to everyone, although it feels like some days we are. So I'd say, well-intentioned ideas here, certainly, but then when you go from well-intentioned ideas to drafting specific language, there is sometimes maybe a disconnect, and that's where the public comment period Adriana mentioned could come into play. So, I'll get into the definitions, but one thing to think through of what I'm describing, this is a proposal from New York State. This isn't the final answer to everything. If there's something we're saying that doesn't sit right, doesn't sound right, or you're saying, why the hell did they do it that way? I could have qualified, but for this word or that phrasing, the public comment process is powerful. It doesn't need to be formal, written, it could just be an email saying, change the word conviction to arrest, something as simple as that, and your voice will be heard. And if there's enough comments like that going on, Vladimir talked about his signature campaign from CRTA to MRTA, something similar. If there's a movement afoot to change this language, we can see meaningful change. So with all of that in mind, here are the criteria to qualify as a justice involved individual. So your primary residence at time of an individual's arrest or conviction, it has to be in an area with historically high rates of arrest, conviction, or incarceration. So this is all related to marijuana-related events. So you need to make sure that the justice-involved individual, did have a conviction in New York State during either you, a parent, or a relative, and it needs to be a New York State conviction. So not an arrest, not a federal charge, not a state conviction in Connecticut or New Jersey. So it really is being hyper-focused on New York again for a conviction. And justice-involved individual, it could be yourself personally, or it can be a close relative, a parent, a sibling, a child. So it does need to have a nexus between yourself and, essentially the impact that this conviction related to a marijuana offense would have on you as an individual. And it needs to have been within a certain time period. They're trying not to have it be, years and years ago. So it needs to be within, and I'll pull up the exact date, but they did put in, some language about exactly when this conviction needs to happen. So it needs to have happened. Apologies.
It's before March 31st, 2021.
So before
Thank
the
you.
MRTA was passed.
Yeah.
Before the MRTA was passed.
Right.
Well,
So
my understanding is it could be any time before that.
Yep. But again, needing to be a conviction in New York State before that date for you as an individual, a parent, spouse, child, dependent, or anyone related to a marijuana-related offense. So, we don't yet know marijuana-related offense. Will that go out to, paraphernalia and going beyond, what we think of as marijuana-related? But you also would need to provide evidence that this individual, where their primary residence was, again, nexus and ties back to New York, and then the justice-involved individual back to that needing to hold 10% ownership and control in the net profits of the business. So a lot of moving pieces here that could have opportunity for comment and change going forward.
Thank you. So back to the question I tried to ask 5 minutes ago. Vlad, what do you think about defining it in such a narrow way? Only New York State convictions.
I'm going to be honest. I really like that because, it's what I also like about what New York State is doing is that they're making it New York focused, because the reality is, me being a victim of this, if we just go back not even too far, we can go to 2020. The numbers state that all arrests for cannabis were 95% Black and brown people. from New York. So I think that I'm in agreement with that part, because the first people that should be able to benefit are the people that were targets of this war on drugs that they had and on cannabis, that are from New York. You know, the rest, wherever you're from, you should benefit from what's going on where you're from. But I am in agreement with the fact that it's focused on more New York natives, because, we're kind of like one of the last of the parties. And after 80 years of prohibition, the harm that is done is immeasurable. I'm going to give you an example of myself. Like me growing up in Harlem, Hamilton Heights, like, we thought it was normal for consuming cannabis to be arrested 4 or 5 times a year and be put through the system for 24 hours, because the NYPD targeted urban areas like this to make their quotas and use cannabis as like, the guaranteed thing where they will be able to pick up a lot of people. So I think that for that same reason, the people that went through that should have the highest odds of benefiting off of these type of programs.
Makes sense. And you have to draw the line somewhere if you're going to prioritize New Yorkers.
And it's interesting, we got a comment through YouTube, and I'm going to quote it. It says, a lot of these caveats feel defeating for someone who wants to be legit. Now, I understand where like all of these requirements, especially as they're written in a regulation, are really, quite specific, and they act as a funnel. But at the same time, to do what Vlad just described, which is to put New York as a priority, to put certain communities and to put certain individuals kind of at the top of the list, you need to have requirements. I think that the best way to do it is to kind of try to flip the optic, which is really to look at this funnel as a way of shining a light on the first people that need to be told and encouraged to apply. So yeah, it's going to be, it's going to weed out people for whom it's not intended for. But I think that as a community, we should be reaching out to individuals that might fit these profiles and encouraging them and supporting them to receive this first round of applications. But I guess, I know I'm a lawyer, but it's like, you can't really support that special category of individuals if you don't create these very specific regulations.
And I just want to piggyback off something you said. It's also, the priority and first. None of this is detracting from later, normal retail applications, traditional cultivator licenses. The rest of the license types that we haven't touched on today are still going to be available. This is talking about priority in the opportunity to be licensed, to become operational. So it's just right now priority. And as everyone's been saying, there's reasons behind the priority, but that's not to say you're not going to have an opportunity to enter this market. If you don't meet those standards, you just may have to wait for others.
Right.
You also, though, don't get access to a lot of the financial incentives that the state is offering. Like they're offering a lease, like a low-cost lease. They're offering a loan. Like, this is like if Cuba legalized cannabis and it's like, we're going to have this program, we're going to organize it and let's make it work. That's what, I don't know, like that's how I think of it in my mind. And I really appreciate like the policy ideas behind it. I just don't know how this works out in practice. And I also feel for like the people who get in touch and are like, I was charged multiple and I got an ECD and I felt like I hit the jackpot when I got it, but it turns out now I don't qualify. Then there are other folks who might have like the conviction and don't have ownership and control of a business. Maybe they're in a managerial position, but they're not owners. So, but maybe when you're making an omelet, you got to break some eggs and you have to draw the line somewhere.
Yeah, I'll give my personal opinion. What I worry about is, so this is where I worry that socioeconomic discrepancies are already going to influence this process. The type of documentation that you need to submit to prove ownership and percentages and control. It's a very sophisticated kind of corporate documents, right? we could make a very strong argument that a lot of the legacy operators, and Vlad, you tell me if I'm wrong, a lot of the legacy operators are not going out there and drafting really specific operating agreements, detailing the ownership share of different individuals. I mean, a lot of the legacy reality is based on handshakes and trust and just doing things. So I think that that's the one part of the reg that I really worry about. It's not so much the justice involved individual specifications. It's more of these corporate document requirements. So you're throwing on a population that has been socioeconomically disadvantaged and hasn't traditionally used lawyers and drafted certain types of documents. You're all of a sudden superimposing onto them certain requirements of communication that certain requirements of proof that might be very difficult to present. So that's my personal opinion about which part of this I most worry about.
Yeah, I am in agreement, and the key is this, right? Because I am also, what we've been able to do that I think has separated us as a movement and as a company is this: we're sort of the nexus between culture, legacy, corporate, and politics, right? Like we straddle the fence of all these things. So what I try to do is I try to put myself in everybody's shoes, because I also understand that everybody has people to answer to, constituents, etc. So I think the key to, in the comment period, to getting them to change that, as far as like the percentage of ownership for 2 years and the detailed documents and etc. The reason that they're putting that in there is because they want to try to make sure that the person has some type of business acumen. It's understandable. So now what the counter has to be is something more low barrier that still proves that the person is competent, as a competent business person. I think is a realistic way to get them to change that. Because if we just tell them to take it off without a replacement, I think it's going to be a lot harder to pull off.
Absolutely.
Well, especially as Jen pointed out, they're acting as landlord. So, if they have tenants that stop paying rent or are not successful, those are the headlines I'm dreading. New York State, forecloses lease on, insert justice involved individual's name. So I get the logic, and that's solid advice of saying, we should, when commenting, try to provide alternative language rather than just saying this is terrible, get rid of it.
Yeah, because like I said, it's realistic and it's practical. Good. I wanted to answer a question here that's in the comments. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It says right here, given that New York is trying to be New York focused, are you concerned about the inherent inequity in vertical integration being banned for anyone who is not in the medical market? Well, I'm not as concerned from the business perspective, right? Because like I said, I think New York City is the biggest market in the world, and I think there's going to be no shortage of money and opportunity just because there's MSOs, because I don't see them limiting things like they have in other places. As far as I haven't heard of any caps yet on grows. I haven't heard of any caps yet on dispensaries. So I'm not concerned in that aspect. In the aspect that I am concerned is that right now we have 10 ROs, and from my due diligence and my studies, this is supposed to be for medicinal purposes for so many people that have so many ailments and so many different sicknesses. And what I've noticed is that none of these ROs are serving Black and brown communities. They are all in more upper class, upper middle class, wealthy areas. And I think that is the biggest issue, where I think that the current 10RO holders don't have the cultural competency to deal with Black and brown neighborhoods, which right now in marginalized neighborhoods, which are the people that need the education and the medicine more than anybody, because they make up a large demographic of the entire state of New York. And I think that those communities are not being served from a medical perspective. So that's my biggest issue. I think that they either need to add some that people that have the cultural competency to deal with Black and brown communities can serve or make some adjustments when it comes to that, because it's a travesty that there are so many people in Latino and Black communities that have sicknesses that cannabis can heal and help, and they're not getting access to the medicine because they doesn't know it exists. They're not being educated and they have no access within their region. That is my biggest concern when it comes to the RO and the medical side.
There, I think expansion of the number of medical operators would make an enormous difference, because medical operators usually charge a lower tax rate. And if you could then have them in more locations, you could go about it that way. Or do you prefer that it's through the adult use market?
No, I think that it needs to be that way from a medical perspective, because like I said, this is a medicine. And
Yeah.
right now, you know, like I said, there's a lot of upper class neighborhood that have this in their area. They're able to maybe walk in, get education on how it could benefit them. And, you know, there's a lot of illnesses that cannabis helps with. And the people in Latino and Black and brown and marginalized communities have no clue this is a medicine. They have no clue about the education. They have no clue there's even a medical program in New York. And I think that needs to change. That's my biggest concern when it comes to the RO and the medicinal program in New York.
Well, we're going to try to enlist you in the NHCC's mission in public education on this front, because that's absolutely the problem. Moving on through our agenda. So we've got all of these savvy justice involved individuals who are eligible for these licenses. And really, as the market opens up, and when beyond these conditional retail licenses, regular retail licenses will become available. I want to skip forward a little bit and ask for, because we are getting close on time, what are some tips for these individuals who are looking to apply? I'll start with you, Adriana.
Sure. So I think the first tip I want to start with is really for people to understand the differences between getting a license writer and a cannabis lawyer. Obviously, this gang here is biased because we are 3 cannabis lawyers that help individuals then, you know, write and draft applications. But really, you know, as you know, what I'd say is figure out yourself, if you will be applying, what are the differences? What does a license writer do? And think about and contemplate. And what is the difference between a license writer and a lawyer? Because there are differences, and it's very, very important that you understand how to avoid the cheap coming out expensive. So that's the first thing. I'm not going to tell you what I think you should do, because that's pretty obvious. I'm going to tell you that you need to figure out the difference. The second thing I'd say is start getting organized earlier than you think you have to. So for example, one of the dearest clients that we have at the law firm signed us up months ago. And really what we're doing now is a lot of the boring but necessary corporate formation and employment contracts and all of the stuff that takes time. And you don't want to have a situation where your legal team is worried about getting an operating agreement ready at the same time as it's writing your license. You don't want to worry about the delay that might take place to set up, to incorporate, to then get your tax EIN, to then. So some of these things take time. They take human hours to draft and for you as an entrepreneur to review. And then you want the license application to kind of sit in a place in your process where certain things are already out of the way and done. And independent contractor agreements take longer than you would think. Operating agreements take longer than you would think. Professional services agreements take longer than you would think. All of these things that are necessary, whether you're a retail operation or a delivery service. So don't wait to do the boring but necessary legal incorporation and cleanup work. Definitely don't give it to a lawyer at the same time as you're worried about a license. Do it early. So that's the first tip that I would give, is it's never too early to have someone look under the hood of your car and give you a very honest evaluation of what is necessary to then run a legitimate legal cannabis business, banking, for example, with a bank that allows for cannabis operations. So there are many of those things. So take your car to the mechanic, have it looked at, figure out what you need to do before that whole licensing phase really opens up. That's my first and biggest tip.
Just to piggyback on that, I would also advise folks, when you are hiring a lawyer, don't pay a lawyer to learn on your dime.
Absolutely
Get
not.
people who know how to do this. Obviously, this is a new industry, and no one with my age went to law school and learned cannabis law, right? Like, you had to learn at some point. Work with folks that already have done that before you're the guinea pig. And for lawyers who want to get into this space, I have a couple of very good relationships with lawyers that really want to do cannabis. They're really interested, and they know they don't know it. Knowing what you don't know is great. And they have teamed up with us, and they've been a source of referrals for us. They handle the corporate work, and they're learning through this iterative process. I think trying to team up with people who know what they're doing is crucial. Michelle, any tips you want to add before I turn over to Vlad?
I have a plan. I mean, it doesn't matter if your plan needs to change, but knowing what license type you want, generally where you're interested in going. I mean, no matter how you're going through this process, changing your mind is going to cost and burn you money and time. So taking the time now before a lot of licenses are available, right now there's only this one, conditional cultivation. So take the time to learn, do you qualify? What does each license entitle you to? What could happen? What's the timeline look like? Obviously you may be really excited about one particular license and you don't qualify, or the timing's not going to be right, so you'll need to pivot. But if you just say, I want to be in this industry, but don't have a clear path, you're going to spin wheels for a while your competitors make meaningful progress. And I'll hand it over, but just in the interest of time, I also wanted to plug, so the state agency OCM just did come out yesterday. They're doing a series of learning workshops specifically focused on card. And so if you just go to OCM website, cannabis.newyork.gov, and you go to the licensing tab, these webinar series, it's going to be, 4 of them talking about, am I eligible for this license? How do I, work with a cannabis conviction? How do I support cultivation? How are we ensuring equity in New York? So in terms of figuring out your plan and getting as much information from the state, this did just roll out yesterday. I just want to let people know they're free, sign up. You're going to hear it directly from the state. I mean, I think what we're all saying is valuable intel, but doesn't replace hearing it directly from the people that are going to be reviewing your licenses.
And I also, just a quick piggyback on that, I dropped in the chat on the Revel. So Revel is a group that runs events that are also educational. Lulu and Jacoby have been incredibly dedicated to what I call the boring but necessary education of the space. They have an event coming up in Yonkers, and and I think I think they're always good complements, right? The state events and then the events run by individuals of the New York cannabis community. You should go to both, because they have different vibes, they have different kinds of information. So really, these are 2 great places to start if the card reality and other licenses are of interest.
I just dropped in the chat the link to the NHCC website, which has a lot of really great web resources for folks that are looking to get into this, including step-by-step plan to help you get started with licensure, a cheat sheet for dealing with local public officials, and so forth. So please reach out to the NHCC directly with any questions, or to any of us. Vlad, your tips.
My tips would be, first of all, to seek, mentorship by either somebody that has gone through the process or is going through the process and is a lot more advanced than you, so you can understand what it takes and what to look out for. And the number one thing that I would tell people to look out for is predators. As all the amazing lawyers on here said, there are predator lawyers, there are predator investors. There are, right now, New York is the focal point of the cannabis world right now. There are killer whales, every shark, every big mammal in the world has their eyes on New York, and they need a token black or brown, a marginalized person to fit this. And they have no problem, if you don't have good representation, really giving you a bad predatory deal as far as investment or partnerships. So be very careful, do your due diligence, and really get a lot of second, third, fourth, fifth opinions before you sign up with a lawyer, before you take any type of investment, before you sign up with a lobbyist, because like I said, it's a time where, people that are not really in the know can really easily get taken advantage of. So my two things is seek mentorship and be careful for the predators, because they're out here in full force.
And absolutely. And if you are approached as a black and brown social equity individual, whatever, for any negotiation, you need to be represented. You need to have your own individual lawyer, even if you are being invited
Big
or
company's lawyer. You can't share the lawyer.
No, you cannot share the lawyer. You need your person to represent your interests, to have your back as you're going into this negotiation and as you are becoming potentially a part of this other company that will have its lawyer. And so ask people in the cannabis community, ask other cannabis related individuals who their lawyers are, and that's really the first place to start. And keep in mind very much what Jennifer said. Get referrals, and then make sure you ask the difficult questions about how much experience those lawyers have with cannabis. They won't tell you the names of their clients. They shouldn't unless they have permission, but they can give you a flavor of what they've done. They can give you quantitative information. They can give you qualitative information. They're not going to tell you who their clients are unless they have permission, but you can locate how much experience they have. Spend the money to have your back protected, because the cheap comes out expensive. Lawyers are expensive, but don't become the social equity person, the token, without that protection.
And I'd say that advice goes to anyone on your team: lawyer, real estate broker, your application writer, whoever you're enlisting to help you throughout this process, your business plan drafter. As Jen said, everyone on your team, you don't want them spending the time Googling what industry terms mean or trying to rip templates off the web to try to quickly tailor it to cannabis. You don't want them to see, oh, wait, I know it's federally illegal. Let me delete the word federal everywhere in this document and think you're covered. No matter who's on your team, you don't want them learning with you, or you might be kicking yourself down the road, anyone involved in this process.
And one last thing about the topic of teams, you'd be surprised at how much you already have to have a team by the time you're drafting a license. So for example, if you're going to be drafting a normal retail license, right? Once those come down the pipeline, you will already have to have a security expert to draft and design the very specific security requirements that are usually required in applications. So again, we don't know what the requirements will be because the regulations haven't dropped, but we know based on other states that usually you need to have a security plan. You're not going to wait until the last minute to hire the experienced security plan people, because those are already getting hired and might have a capacity issue by the time the regs open up. So just, again, inform yourself about everything that you need to do before that license application opens up.
Well, thank you, everyone. I'm just going to put up my screen here. So this is who we are. You'll see at least the lawyer's email addresses. I didn't want to broadcast yours all over the place, Vlad, but I think people who know you can get in touch. You'll see our email addresses at the bottom. The organization is the National Hispanic Cannabis Council. I really want to thank Michelle, Vladimir, Adriana, for your time today. You're sharing your knowledge and your experience. This was a great conversation. The hour went by quickly. And anyone watching, please feel free to get in touch.
Excellent. Thank you very much for inviting me to join.
Yes, same. Thank you.
Right. Till next time.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Remember, you're too blessed to be stressed. Things will get greater later, and always choose happy.